I'm very happy to welcome our keynote speaker today, Fred Cooper, to campus. Fred and I have been conspiring to bring him here over the last 2 years, and I'm thrilled that he's joining us as one of the world's most distinguished historians of Africa. I will provide a more formal welcome afterwards, but I'm so glad you're here. For those of you who are joining from Professor Hart's class, I want to offer a special welcome to our students today. And I'm going to turn over and provide the honor of the introduction to my colleague, Professor Jennifer Hart, who teaches African history at Wayne State and whose own exciting work on automobility brings exciting, important, and original insights into the meaning of citizenship in West Africa. She's an ideal person to be introducing Professor Cooper today. Jennifer Hart.
Thank you. Quite the honor indeed. Frederick Cooper, who's today's plenary speaker, is a professor of history at New York University, and he spent the better part of 4 decades exploring the history of Anglophone and Francophone Africa. Fred's talk today, according to its title, promises to draw on themes of citizenship, decolonization, and empire, which have obvious roots in the whole history of the whole body of his scholarship from its earliest incarnations. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Fred produced a number of books and articles on the history of slavery, plantation labor, and agriculture, which later became core texts in Africanist labor history. And those include plantation slavery on the East African coast and from slaves to squatters, plantation labor and agriculture in Zanzibar and coastal Kenya. These texts, for me, also raised important questions about the constantly renegotiated meanings of belonging in the aftermath of slavery in a region of East Africa that was subject to a complicated set of influences from both the expanding British colonial state and from the imperial ambitions of the Sultan of Oman and the systems of social and economic exchange in the broader Indian Ocean world. Likewise, in his 1987 book on the African waterfront, the third text in this trilogy on African labor, Fred traces the transition from casual to formal wage labor among dock workers in colonial Mombasa, Kenya, in order to highlight the ways in which both the colonial state, African workers, and employers used the structures, institutions, and practices of the new colonial economy to pursue their own ends. In the process, he suggests that the consolidation of colonial rule and the strengthening of the power of the colonial state in shaping the daily lives of Africans developed alongside new opportunities for Africans to assert their autonomy and exert some degree of control over their relations with the state, a theme he continued to pursue in the 1996 book, Decolonization in African Society, which was a comparative study of the labor question in French and British Africa, and in the 2002 synthesis, Africa Since 1940. But decolonization in African society also pointed to the increasing comparative or global nature of Fred's work and his interest in social theory, which engaged not only with the French and British empires in Africa, but which also expanded to include important theoretical and historiographical analyses of colonial and post-colonial studies found both in his own books like Colonialism in Question, a text that I argue every scholar should read, as well as Tensions of Empire, which he co-edited with Anne Laura Stoller, in International Development in the Social Sciences, co-edited with Randall Packard, and a text that he co-authored with Jane Burbank, including their award-winning book, Empires in World History. In the process, he's introduced new and enduring concepts, development colonialism, the gatekeeper state, colonial citizenship, placed Africa in conversation with other parts of the colonial and post-colonial world, and he's encouraged a new way of approaching conversations about empire that takes seriously both the machinations of colonial governance and the experiences and actions of colonial subjects, or citizens, as the case may be. Through this work, Fred has now influenced several generations of historians as both a researcher and an educator, and received an impressive array of awards and accolades. His most recent book, Citizenship Between Empire and Nation, France and French Africa, 1945 to 1960, which he says we should all go buy and is available here, reflects the continual expansion of these trends and themes in his scholarly work. Today, we look forward to hearing him speak on a portion of this new work in his talk titled Citizenship, Empire, and Decolonization, French West Africa, 1945 to 1960. Please welcome Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that very generous introduction and for plugging my books, and to Mark and colleagues for inviting me here, and to all of you for being here, sitting around these tables without a bottle of wine, and for a song and dance routine and a glass of wine. Anyway, here we go. Citizenship, ever since the French Revolution, has been associated with the nation. The citizen is a member of a collectivity with both rights and obligations, and above all, a voice in governance. Yet from the very beginning, the relationship of citizenship to nation was uncertain. No sooner had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen been issued in Paris in 1789 than people from France's colonies, some from European France, some of mixed race, and even slaves from Africa claimed rights. Intense debates after 1789 raised the question that is still alive in the 21st century, as much as it was in the 18th. How can one forge a community among people who are diverse and unequal? Unequal in the resources they have access to, unequal in education, unequal in the ability to claim the other rights that they, in theory, possess. Citizenship, it would seem, both presumes and fosters a language of equivalence, a horizontal view of society, an insistence that no distinction of status can come among citizens. The official line in France today is that one cannot even ask about a person's race, ethnicity, or religion on a census because the government recognizes only one status, that of a person who is French. The same logic that rejected the notion of a nobility now equates any official recognition of difference, including affirmative action, with communitarianism that has no place in a republic. But we know that people come to their relationship with the state with different patterns of affinity and different resources. And we know that the limits of equality are in all forms of polities contested. In France, it took from 1789 to 1944 for women who were citizens from the beginning to get the vote. The rationale for excluding them was that they were not really independent actors in political society. They were dependent on their husbands, and giving women the vote would be like giving the husband two. Later, much of the French left opposed giving women the vote because they thought that they would vote the way their priests told them to. These were sociological observations, however dubious, but they betrayed the fact that social status is very much a concern to debates about citizenship. Similar arguments were invoked whenever the possibility of extending citizenship rights to people in French colonies was raised. What concerns me today is the imperial dimension of citizenship debates. The question of citizenship beyond the nation, but fundamentally how a polity that insists on the principle of equivalence of citizens can come to grips with the diversity of people who make up the body politic. When the possibility of extending citizenship to France's overseas colonies came up after World War II, both advocates and opponents recalled the debates on this subject in 1789. And they even evoked a precedent from 212 AD. The Roman Emperor Caracalla had decreed then that all free male inhabitants of the Roman Empire would be considered citizens. They did not have to come from Rome. They did not have to speak Latin or otherwise embrace the culture of the Roman elite. In 1946, the analogy was invoked to claim that people could be considered French citizens without giving up their local civilizations, as advocates termed it at the time. Opponents of extending citizenship mocked the idea of a new edict of Caracalla. I use the term imperial citizenship. Empires frankly embrace their inequality and diversity. They are, in a particular way, inclusive polities. They force people to enter and prevent them from leaving. As in Rome, the question of whether conquered people could be considered citizens or confined to some other inferior status was a matter of strategy and debate about the balance to be struck between the incorporative and the differentiating, indeed repressing, dimension of empire. I am hardly the only citizenship studies scholar to be talking about citizenship beyond the nation. There has been a spate of studies recently on post-national citizenship. One of the earliest and best is Yasmin Soysal's Limits of Citizenship, Migrants and Post-National Membership in Europe. She makes the point that workers who move around Europe obtain some of the rights of the citizen, including the rights of the citizen within nations that are not their own, including rights to collective bargaining, to medical care, to schooling for their children, to equal treatment in legal procedures, and in some cases even the right to vote in local elections. Citizenship rights, then, have become detached from nationality and are potentially both divisible and overlapping. Iwa Ong in Flexible Citizenship has argued that in today's interconnected world, many people develop relations with multiple states and claim rights in those states. These points are well taken, but they aren't particularly post. The possibility of citizenship beyond the nation is as old as the possibility of the nation, and the concept of citizenship predates the nation by a couple of millennia. What is at stake here, however, has relevance to the present day, certainly in France and undoubtedly elsewhere. I'm going to talk about an episode in the history of citizenship and the history of France in which the possibility of being a citizen in different ways was open and debated. The notion of a heterogeneous citizenry exists not just in the imagination of the future, in theories of cultural recognition, but in the past. It is not surprisingly an ambiguous past, for the story I'm about to tell begins in the context of colonial empire, a situation of invidious distinction, of exploitation, of repression, but as a story of multiple routes out of empire, not just the dichotomy of empire and nation state. And locating citizenship at the level of empire is where the story begins. But let me start with a quick look back to the 18th century. It was not clear in 1789 to whom the principle of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen applied. To some, the French nation was a bounded entity in Europe. But in the midst of the revolution, people in the colonies began to claim that the rights of the citizen extended to an imperial, transoceanic France. In the plantation colony of Saint-Domingue, French planters, then property-owning people of mixed race, and finally the slaves, revolting in 1791, invoked citizenship discourse to claim their place in a revolutionary society. The freeing of slaves in Saint-Domingue in 1793 and in other French colonies in 1794 reflected both the inclusive version of citizenship principles and a much more pragmatic government need for new categories of citizens to defend the revolution against royalists and other empires seeking to take over this lucrative colony. The revolution of Saint-Domingue, like most successful social movements, brought together people from across social categories that, before aiming at seceding from France, sought to make France into a different kind of polity, an empire of free citizens. Its famous leader, Toussaint Louverture, was for a time a commissioner of the French revolutionary government. Empire citizenship was ended by Napoleon, who reinstated slavery in 1802. It was at this point that the Saint-Domingue Revolution turned from remaking empire to exiting it. Napoleon's army failed to subdue the revolution, and the proclamation of the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804 was the flip side of Napoleon's restoration of slavery in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and other colonies. France itself would be ruled by kings or empires for most of the 19th century. Under monarchical or republican government, the line between a national France and an imperial France was frequently contested. In 1848, the definitive abolition of slavery in French colonies left an entire category of people of African descent as citizens, rather than members of an intermediate category. In the oldest of the sub-Saharan African colonies, the Quatre Communes, the four towns of Senegal, the government recognizes citizenship rights, including the right to vote, of original inhabitants. This after 1848. And some of you heard Poppy Fry talk about this situation earlier this morning. Unlike their Caribbean compatriots, whose personal lives were regulated under the French Civil Code, the originaires, the original inhabitants of the Quatre Communes, could exercise their right to vote without giving up the right to come under Islamic law in civil affairs, notably marriage and inheritance. But their situation was increasingly marginal. In Algeria, conquered beginning in 1830, Muslim Algerians, and Jews too until 1870, were French subjects and French nationals, but not French citizens. To become a French citizen, they would have to renounce their personal status under Islamic law, coming under the French Civil Code. French officials would decide if they had accepted the French way of life. Few wanted to make such a move, fewer still were accepted. This model was extended into sub-Saharan Africa with the conquests of the late 19th century. When France became a republic in 1871, some legislators considered that relegating Algerians or Africans to the status of subject was incompatible with republican ideals. All people were supposed to be equivalent. Their arguments were rejected, but the possibility had been posed. When France had greater need for its people to serve in wartime, inclusionary rhetoric became stronger, only to be pulled back when veterans claimed fuller rights on the basis of having paid the blood tax. Colonialism was a moving target. After World War II, European powers knew that things would have to change, but sought to invigorate and re-legitimate empire rather than abandon it. France made use of military power, torture, and collective punishment in an effort to keep the empire intact. Yet keeping the empire together also entailed an effort to give at least some people a stake in its institutions. France, after the war, was swinging between the repressive and incorporative poles. At the end of the war, the new government of Charles de Gaulle renamed the empire the French Union and renamed colonies overseas territories. The government accepted that colonial subjects had to participate in the writing of a new constitution and the legislature of a new republic, but not in proportion to their numbers, for colonial subjects outnumbered the people, the citizens of European France. Certain aspects of colonial rule, like forced labor or a separate system of justice, could not stand the exposure given them when even a tiny number of African deputies began to sit in the Parisian legislature. And legislative leaders realized that if colonial deputies as a whole refused to go along with the constitutional process, the provisions on the overseas territories, the French Union, would have no legitimacy. The African territories' electorates, voting for members of the Assemblée Nationale Constituante, were divided into two colleges, one for citizens, dominated by residents of European origins living in the colonies, and one for subjects, mainly Africans when we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, except in the case of Senegal. From the earliest drafts of the constitutional provisions on the French Union, the deputies seemed to agree that all subjects should acquire the quality of the French citizen, with the rights connected to that status, and they should have these rights without having to give up their personal status. Léopold Senghor, deputy elected by the Subjects College, Electoral College in Senegal, developed in a report for the Assembly the argument for generalized citizenship with diverse civil regimes. He evoked the revolutionary heritage, citing the decree of 1794 that had made slaves into French citizens. He condemned Napoleon for reestablishing slavery and praised the revolutionary government of 1848 for definitively making the slaves of the Caribbean into citizens. But now the situation was different. In 1798 and 1848, the Jacobin tradition was vital, he said. Everyone would have to be a citizen in the same way. But since 1848, he added, there had been progress in ethnology. France had discovered the vigor of Arab, Chinese, Indian, and African civilizations. To codify a France that respected simultaneously difference and equivalence meant a compromise between federal and unitary visions of government. He proposed that all French subjects be defined as simply citizens. All overseas citizens would be represented in the federal parliament, but not in large numbers. At the same time, each colony would have a territorial assembly that would be stronger than the assemblies in the regions of France. The draft constitution that emerged was vague on the powers of different assemblies and modes of elections, but all seemed for a moment to agree that inhabitants of overseas territories should be citizens and participate somehow in governing themselves, compromising between a homogenizing Frenchness and dichotomous difference. As a centrist deputy put it, we are today partisan of a pluralist democracy that is a democracy of groups. Citizens whose status was currently other than the civil code could retain that status unless they renounced it. It was in this context that deputies evoked the decree of Caracalla of 212 AD. Fearing that the draft constitution might be defeated in the referendum on its approval, Lamine Gueye, Senegal's other deputy, and he was from one of the Quatre Communes, asked the assembly to put in the form of an ordinary law the constitution's provision on citizenship. The bill passed unanimously. The generalization of citizenship around the world became known as the Lamine Gueye law. The proposed constitution was in fact voted down in a referendum in which only people who were citizens under the previous constitution had the right to vote, leaving out most Africans. The defeat led to new elections and a more conservative assembly. Over the summer, defenders of old-style colonialism mobilized, attacking the extension of citizenship except individual by individual, which it had been all along. As the debate resumed in the second assembly, an influential deputy warned that if one took literally the notion of all citizens participating equally in electoral institutions, then France would become, quote, the colony of its former colonies. At this, Léopold Senghor jumped up to reply, this is racism. But a unitary conception of French politics, one citizen, one vote, was not at issue. Senghor and his African colleagues wanted a pluralist, federal France in which each component, including European France, would exercise power over its own affairs and express its own personality, while a federal government with limited powers would oversee what was the common good. When the governing party tried to dilute the citizenship provisions of the previous draft, overseas deputies walked out, and the government had to back down. The citizenship provision came back with studied ambiguity. All inhabitants of all French territories would be citizens. The inhabitants of what used to be called protectorates, like Morocco and Tunisia, would have the qualities of citizens of the French Union. The distinction reflected the complexity of imperial France, the composite nature of an empire. Inhabitants of the African colonies were nationals of the French Republic, although until May 1946 they were not citizens of it. But Moroccans and Tunisians and Vietnamese had their own nationalities, not the French one. They were protected by France, in quotes. So Africans in 1946 became French citizens. Moroccans were Moroccan nationals, but citizens of the French Union. The right of citizens who did not have French civil status to keep that status unless they renounced it and still have all the rights and liberties attached to their quality of French citizen was guaranteed under the Constitution. Together, these provisions allowed the French Overseas Ministry to claim, quote, the legislature wanted to mark the perfect equality of all in public life, but not the perfect identity of the French of the metropole and the overseas French, end quote. Was France in 1946 multicultural as well as egalitarian? Hardly. Ultimate power resided in a National Assembly, which included representatives from overseas, but few of them. The federal idea was honored by the Assembly of the French Union, half of whose members came from overseas. But this assembly had only a consultative role. It couldn't actually legislate. While the president of the French Union, the president of the Republic wearing a different hat, represented federal executive authority, he had no federal cabinet or ministries. These powers resided in the prime minister, but he was responsible only to the National Assembly. Just as the sanctifying of the French citizen in the Revolution of 1789 did not bring women the vote until 1944, the Fourth Republic's generalization of citizenship did not result in universal suffrage until 1956. It kept in place two electoral colleges, in effect guaranteeing seats to voters of French civil status, who are mostly white, with a second college for the vast majority of people who had Islamic or customary civil status. The territorial assemblies in Senegal and Dahomey and Cote d'Ivoire, etc., had few powers. Despite these weaknesses and hypocrisy, citizenship was a breakthrough. It is a claim-making construct whose power lies in the fact that it weaves together obligations and rights. West African political and social movements appreciated the claim-making powers of citizenship very well. They kept up steady pressure in the 1940s and 1950s to remedy the defects of the Constitution, to give the assemblies in the territories real power, to create a federal assembly also with real power, and to bring about universal suffrage and a single electoral college. The other side of the mobilizing effort entailed developing the social and economic dimensions of citizenship, not just the political ones. Social citizenship meant a great deal more in European France after the war than it did before, as social entitlements were expanded and consolidated into a welfare state. Africans could claim that social legislation applied to them as much as any other citizen, and they argued strongly for equal wages, for equal work, for equal benefits, for equal education, and equal access to medical care. The social dimensions of citizenship posed a dilemma to French government leaders. Even while the Constitution was being debated, a wave of strikes, including a general strike that shut down Dakar for 10 days, had taken place in Senegal, and the slogan was equal pay for equal work. Strikers, from civil servants to dockers, only went back to work when officials made large concessions on wages and family allowances and accepted the normality of negotiating with African trade unions within a structure of industrial relations virtually identical to that of European France. Social movements and the rhetoric of citizenship reinforced each other. The logic of equivalence implied that the standard of living of African France had to be leveled upward, with no obvious place to stop than the standard of living in European France. By the 1950s, the government was reeling under the escalating demands for equivalence and willing to concede key political demands in the hope that it could distance itself from the social ones. Elections in 1957 under universal suffrage in each territory put in place territorial governments elected by the African majority. The once anemic territorial assemblies were given budgetary authority, while the institutions that exercised important functions for all the territories of French West Africa, heretofore a means of administrative centralization, were stripped of most of their power. Now French leaders hoped African leaders elected by African taxpayers in each territory would have to pay the bills for social entitlements. Although aware that increased autonomy for territories meant less of a claim for resources of the French Republic, African leaders saw this 1956 law as a victory, for they finally won universal suffrage, the end of the reserved seats for white settlers, and strong territorial assemblies. When African political parties won all the territorial elections, their leaders sought to exercise the power that the new law conferred on them. Senghor saw more clearly than most how high the price was. Africa was, in his word, balkanized, an allusion to another imperial breakup, that of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires after World War I in the Balkans, creating small states, too weak, too poor to be politically effective. But Africans were still French citizens. What did it mean to have a single French citizenship with multiple civil status regimes, with all people in European France coming under the civil code, but most people in African France coming under the civil regime of Islamic or customary law? The key concerns were marriage and inheritance, and the issue that most French officials mentioned most often was polygamy. Islamic law allows a man 4 wives, the French Civil Code 1. Officials realized they needed to specify rules by which marriages, births, and inheritance could be recorded under different regimes of personal status. But the government never managed to enact a legislative text on this matter. Government reluctance to define rules for change of status reflecting a lingering belief that the civil code represented a French culture that had to be protected against people attached to local customs such as polygamy. So the logic of the constitutional provision about equality with recognition of different status regimes was something the legislatures actually couldn't come to grips with. Africans were ambivalent about another right implicit in the Constitution but not spelled out, for someone of Islamic or customary civil status to come, by choice, under the French Civil Code. Some African political actors thought renouncing one's civil status was equivalent to renouncing one's culture, an insult. Others wanted to ratify their conversion to Christianity or to escape from the inheritance rules of their own society. In 1955, the French Constitutional Court reminded everyone that under the Constitution, accession to French civil status was a right, not a favor. The inability to provide a legislative basis for a multicultural citizenry makes clear, however, that Frenchness was neither culturally nor historically neutral. Officials feared both that French social order would be compromised by admitting unworthy people into it, and that the indigenous societies of Africa would be undermined by weakening their apparently unique structure of social relations. French legislators were ill at ease with the notion that Africans were different but equivalent. Senghor had an insightful approach to the politics of citizenship in the context of inequality. He argued that Africans needed two kinds of solidarity: horizontal, of Africans with each other, and vertical, with France. Vertical solidarity implied a claim on the resources of the richer entity. It was a frank admission of the reality of social and economic inequality. But vertical solidarity without horizontal would be a new form of colonialism. Horizontal solidarity without vertical would be unity in poverty. One had to combine the two. The colonies of Senegal, Ivory Coast, the French Sudan, Dahomey, Guinea, Niger, Upper Volta, and Mauritania were already part of an administrative unit called French West Africa, the similarly French Equatorial Africa. Senghor wanted to turn that unit into a political unit with a legislature and executive to express Africans' horizontal solidarity. He thought the idea of a nation applied to that unit, or even to Africa as a whole, not to his native Senegal. The Federation of French West Africa, as he called it, would participate as a single unit in a French union, now transformed into a confederation. A confederation differs from a federation by recognizing the national status of its component parts. Senghor compared nationalism, and it was really the ism that he was against, not the notion of a nation. He compared nationalism to an old hunting rifle, no longer useful in an interconnected world. His federation was an expression of a Negro-African civilization, as well as a political unit more practical than the nation state. Its linkage to the French Confederation would give Africans access to resources of wealthier parts of the unit, not as supplicants asking for aid, but as citizens with a voice in distributing the resources of the larger, more inclusive unit. As Senghor's Senegalese fellow politician, Mamadou Dia, put it, it is necessary that the imperialist conception of the nation state give way definitively to the modern conception of the multinational state. And this quotation that you see on the board is practically the only instance in all the research I've done in the 1950s political writing by Africans in which the phrase nation state appears. And as you see, it appears in a negative light. In Mamadou Dia's quotation, as in Senghor's arguments about horizontal and vertical solidarity, we see ideas of what we might call layered sovereignty: territorial, Pan-African, Franco-African. The goal was both cultural and practical, a balance of different sorts of connections. Not all African leaders agreed. Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the leading politician of the Côte d'Ivoire, rejected the African Federation. He considered it, quote, a useless and onerous relay between Paris and the states of West and Equatorial Africa, end quote. He wanted those states to participate directly and individually in a French federation in which all participants, African states as much as the European France, would be equal. Now, variations on the Senghorian or the Houphouët-Boigny, and if there is such a word, viewpoint were important throughout French West Africa, and it was one or the other of these variants that was by far predominant. Before 1957, there was one significant political party that was calling for independence in the French Trust territory of Cameroon, and the French government succeeded in marginalizing and repressing it. In French West Africa, calls for independence came originally from student groups, and a party expressing this point of view was only created in 1957. Some French leaders were thinking on an even larger scale, to combine a French federation or confederation with the growing effort to build a European community, creating what they called Eurafrica. Senghor liked the idea too, provided Africans would have a full voice in governing Eurafrica. France's would-be partners in creating Europe, however, did not agree on including impoverished African territories as full-fledged members. Meanwhile, a right-wing anti-colonialism was surfacing in European France, an argument that colonies, given the escalating demands for development and social expenditures, were costing France more than they were bringing in, and they should be allowed to go their own way. Different definitions of France were in play in the mid-1950s, different definitions of Africa, some more national than others. The context was shaped by the war in Algeria, the crisis in French politics, and de Gaulle's coming back to power in 1958. After October 1958, the French Union was renamed the Community, another attempt to reconfigure a France that was wider than Europe, a France that had once been called the French Empire and had once been called the French Union. Now it was the Community. The new Constitution of 58 retained a central feature of the 1946 version. The people in the overseas territories were rights-bearing French citizens, independent of personal status. However, overseas territories became member states of the Community. They had the right to exit to independence if they so chose. Member states would be self-governing, except in regard to foreign affairs, defense, monetary policy, and a few other designated areas. Their representatives would no longer sit in the National Assembly, the legislative body. However, heads of each government would meet regularly with the French government and prime minister in what was called the Executive Council. All the potential members except Guinea voted in 1958 to accept this constitution. Guinea voted no, became independent, and was cut off from French resources. The 1958 Constitution stated that there was only one citizenship, and that was, quote, of the French Republic and of the Community. Citizens could exercise their rights in the territory of any member state. It was portable within the community. But the Constitution said nothing about nationality, and there ensued an interesting debate. At the February 1959 meeting of the Executive Council, a decision was taken that there was only one nationality in the community, the French one. But African leaders were not happy with that decision and insisted on further consideration of whether there was one or multiple nationalities. Two concepts of nationality were in play, as they are in much of the world. The French government employed a classic notion in international relations. Nationality was defined by a community of already existing nations, recognizing the distinct personality of a given political entity. African leaders thought of nationality as coming not from without, but from within, as a sense of collective purpose and action. In such terms, the insistence that France had nationality, while African member states did not, was demeaning. French leaders got the point. The initial French position gave way, a committee of experts was called in, and they came up with a new synthesis. Their idea was that of superposed nationality, nationalité superposée in French. Each member state would have its own nationality. It would write its own nationality laws. It would decide whom to be considered a national of that state. Then that nationality conferred by an individual state would automatically confer nationality at the level of the community. Inside the community, there would be many nationalities, but the outside world would see only one, that of the French Republic and of the community. We are far from the idea of sovereignty as absolute and territorial, so dear to international relations experts and lawyers. We see here notions of layered sovereignty, different nationalities and different forms of government within a single political entity that was still considered French. Superposed nationality was accepted by the Executive Council and President de Gaulle in December 1959. But the argument of where in Africa nations would lie was still not settled. With Senghor and Dia continuing to advocate an African federation, Houphouët-Boigny focused on the individual territory. Time was not on Senghor's side, for the reality of territorial power was bringing leaders to invoke a territorialized vision of the nation. In Côte d'Ivoire, riots against non-Ivoirian Africans date to 1958. For a time, it looked as if Upper Volta, Niger, and Dahomey would join Senegal and the French Sudan in trying to overcome these obstacles and create an African federation that would in turn participate in the French community. But in the end, only Sudan and Senegal went forward. The Mali Confederation, created within the community in 1959, embodied layered sovereignty, with certain functions left to the two federated states, others at the federal level, Mali, and still others, including for the moment defense and foreign affairs, at the level of the community. But with Guinea independent and Houphouët-Boigny antagonistic, it was clear that the dream of African unity, horizontal solidarity in the fullest sense, was unobtainable. It wasn't going to happen. The reality was Mali's bilateral relationship with France. And in those terms, a negotiated independence with a continued relationship to France was the second best option to a more inclusive, more layered approach that would have made Mali into something that was truly Pan-African. Mali began in early 1960 to negotiate with France over the terms of independence. Once Mali opted to demand independence, as was its right, and in the context of English-speaking Ghana having obtained independence in 1957, Houphouët-Boigny and his allies followed suit. The idea of a superposed community nationality became obsolete before it was implemented, for Mali's independence would imply its own nationality. But the French government hadn't given up on its hope of keeping community alive. It now changed its own constitution to allow member states becoming independent to remain members of the community. The independence agreements would allow Malians to keep by treaty some of the rights they had had as French citizens, including the right to travel, to settle in, and live in European France. Contrary to what a present-day observer of France might expect, French negotiators had no qualms about allowing Malian citizens to have free entry into France, to stay or return as they wished, to attend French schools, and to work in France. What French leaders worried about was the possibility of excluding French citizens from living in and doing business in former French Africa. Mali got most of it what it wanted from the negotiations. So eager was the French government to maintain itself as something other than a polity located only in Europe. In the middle of 1960, both France and Mali backed into more national positions than either had wanted in the past 15 years. The Mali Federation broke up shortly after independence, largely over fears of the leaders of Senegal and the Sudan that their own political bases would be undermined by the partner. The collapse of the Mali Federation and of the French community came together. For one of the main reasons Africans wanted community was to build an African federation under its umbrella. With independence disappeared the possibilities of layered sovereignty that had been on the table since 1946. France, like the new African states emerging from its authority, would be a conventional nation state. Senegal and the Sudan, which kept the name of Mali for itself, Republic of Mali rather than Federation of Mali, became separate states and soon passed their own nationality acts. France revised its own nationality law, trying to soften the separation of nationalities by allowing former citizens born before the date of independence to reassert their French nationality as long as they established residence in the current boundaries of the French Republic. They would not have to be naturalized. Under the independence treaties, nationals of African states continued to have the right to enter and reside in France, even if they didn't acquire French nationality. But treaties, unlike constitutional provisions, can be abrogated or renegotiated. France in the 1960s and 1970s was no longer trying to keep together, one way or another, a diverse political entity. When politics took an exclusionary turn in the 1970s, the option of changing its rules was France's to make. Africans would no longer be consulted, and the right of free circulation fell by the wayside in 1974. With a tightening of immigration rules in 1974 and rising xenophobia in France in the 1980s, the idea of a clearly defined French nation defending itself and its republican values against outsiders became staples of French political discourse. Such a notion of France requires erasing not just a long history of colonization, but a brief but important period between 1945 and 1960, when different versions of a plural France, in which sovereignty was divided across different layers of government, which recognized juridically different forms of civic life, and which put forth the radical claim that these different forms are compatible with political and social equality. Independence did not mean the triumph of the horizontal solidarity of Africans over the vertical solidarity with the former colonizing power. Independence has witnessed the de facto triumph of vertical relations of power within Africa and between Africa and Europe. The ruling elites of each African territory had obtained sovereignty, but not the resources to meet the demands of their citizens. They sought to dismantle the citizenship mobilizations they had ridden to power and sought to keep the distribution of scarce resources in their own hands. The kinds of institutions, whether in the territory, in the one-time structures of French West Africa, or in African membership in French institutions, that provided relatively transparent structures for debate and criticism, were dismantled. What developed instead between the new African states and France were patron-client relations, both between the rich industrial states like France and African leaders, and within African states between patrons and clients. Vertical power, vertical solidarity, we might call it. Citizenship was thinned out, becoming a brittle insistence on exclusive membership in the nation without necessarily allowing for citizens to exercise full voice in that nation or to claim the resources of the nation. The politics of citizenship was dismantled within a few years of independence in virtually all of French Africa, to be resurrected periodically by student movements, by popular movements in African countries in recent times, including today. Let me conclude. Few French people today remember that for a brief period between the end of World War II and 1960, France recognized that people could be citizens in more than one way. Citizenship in a republic is now seen in universalistic, unitary, and exclusionary terms. But what of the citizen who does not see his or her own place in such a construct? After the assassinations, I'm talking about the Charlie Hebdo affair, of January 7 to 9, 2015, and the refusal of some students in schools in the suburbs with a high percentage of Muslim students and a high level of alienation to participate in the minute of silence the government decreed, officials came up with a didactic and punitive approach to this problem. Lessons in Republican values would be enforced in all the French schools. Everyone should be made to sing the Marseillaise. Dissident views could be labeled apologies for terrorism and forbidden. This is a brittle notion of citizenship. When France was trying to hold together a political entity larger than European France, it had to dialogue with representatives of different kinds of citizens, at least in the circumstances of the post-World War II era. Such possibilities are not utopian fantasies, nor are they post-national. They have a past. The exercise of citizenship in such a context was always problematic. European French people did not necessarily accept the equivalence of different civilizations that their constitution implied. Electoral and legislative institutions were far from egalitarian. French Africans, much as they claimed the social and political rights of the citizen, worried that the citizenship in question was French. But there were places where such issues could be and were debated. Under the law, an African could be a citizen of France and something else, an African elder, a Muslim patriarch, an African patriot. People tried to figure out, unsuccessfully in the end, institutional mechanisms for the expression of distinct national personalities and destinies within a greater France. That such possibilities emerged out of a colonial system that had systematically degraded subjects and continued to wage wars of violent repression against movements that crossed a certain line is part of the volatility of the post-war period. What citizenship entailed in terms of political voice, access to common resources, and protection of individual rights would follow different trajectories in France and in the new African states, both in regard to both citizenship and exclusions from it. I have been telling the story of openings and closures, of possibilities of developing a supple concept of citizenship that could take on the challenges of a diverse and unequal political entity born of a colonial situation. With hindsight, one might say that any such effort was utopian, but with greater hindsight, one might see that the idea that the national framework would produce liberation was itself an illusion, just as Senghor said it was. But it is the tendency toward assuming that a republic or citizenship has only one meaning that we need most to question, reminding ourselves of the political imagination of people in the past might suggest to us the importance of political imagination in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Question about the Berlin Conference of 1885 and the arbitrary lines that got drawn all across Africa. And so I was wondering if there were any debates around subnational citizenship within the individual units, whether those were defined as tribes or religious groups. Did that play any role in this post-1945 debate around what citizenship was going to look like across French West Africa?
It did, and not in a simple way. At first, and let me just cite the example of Senegal. At first, Senghor and his colleague Mamadou Dia encouraged a political group within the region of Senegal that's south of the Gambia. I don't know that it actually shows up very clearly on this map, but the British colony of the Gambia intrudes into the middle of Senegal. So Senegal itself lends itself to division into subnational units, you might say, particularly between this region called the Casamance and the rest of it. At first, Senghor said that a political party organizing in the Casamance could be affiliated with and ally with his political party. But after his political party won, and especially after 1957, when they start to have a significant degree of self-government, that fell by the wayside. And so Senghor was saying, we can have only one. We want to have coherence at the level of Senegal. We cannot have regional subnationalism, and he tightened the screws. And eventually, although this happened long after independence, there was a secessionist movement that developed in the Casamance. So what Senghor was saying is we're going to make an argument about layered sovereignty at the level of the territory and above, that is Africa as a whole and the French community or union as a whole, but not below. This kind of argument is followed by it's the rule rather than the exception in African countries, both French and otherwise, of taking the borders as laid out in the late 19th century as a given and resisting as strongly as possible any revision of those borders. The creation of the South Sudan is one of it's practically the only exception to that. It's not a very happy exception either. So you saw even when a notion of layered sovereignty was being entertained, it had its limits. And since then, you're dealing with a relatively rigid notion of territorial boundaries. Up towards the front.
Okay, all right. Thank you for your wonderful paper. I was wondering if we could think comparatively about this notion or rejection, really, of layered sovereignty, and I'm thinking specifically with the British case, where federation is rejected in the Caribbean. We see in the 1950s as well, when Jamaica had a referendum and opted to not be a part of the federation, and the historian and Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago at the time, Eric Williams, saying 1 from 10 leave not, leave 0, and that led to the demise of the federation. So I'm thinking across the board, is this a wholesale rejection of this whole idea of layered sovereignty, and not just in the French, but in the British case as well?
Well, I think that the issue is certainly wider than one particular case, and it is interesting to think of them in relationship to each other. Jamaica would be taking a position very similar to that of the Côte d'Ivoire, and in both cases they're relatively large and more affluent than some of their neighbors, and so you're dealing with one of the reasons why a federation is useful in large part, that it aggregates resources and makes them more available to the people who have the fewest, is a reason why people in a position of power choose to exercise that power out of self-interest. Of course, this is true in all kinds of federal and non-federal and confederal structures, including the United States, which did have a civil war that erupted over issues about that were framed in terms of relations of regions, whether one part of the country could practice slavery and another could forbid it. So you are dealing with issues that are difficult, and the people involved understood that and tried to solve them. And while I think that the rejection of federation in the British West Indies and French West and Equatorial Africa is something that raises fundamental issues, they're also quite contingent phenomena, and the history of federating is not over. After all, when Europe decided that when France came to a situation where it could not preserve a confederal structure out of its old empire, it decided that it liked the confederal structure in Europe for Europeans, and it clearly has given up a lot of the most basic sovereign functions to create that. And you see all sorts of people complaining about it, but it is a politically realistic phenomenon in Europe. And European countries do not control their currency, and they don't control their borders. And so one should take I think a view of what makes the forms of national entities, or the forms of some kind of supranational entities, see them as historical phenomena, not a universal and necessary condition. So a lot of my book is the first part of it is trying to emphasize the politics of trying to pull together some kind of root out of empire that ends up with a form of complex sovereignty. And the other part of it is trying to explain why this didn't work out. And I think one has to come up with the explanation and see, and I think it has several stages to it, in which possibilities existed and decisions made that narrowed the gap. But Senghor and Modibo Keïta in Mali, this was a proposition that remained alive until 1960, until the summer of 1960. So I think the effort is to be taken seriously, not just its failure.
Thank you so much, Fred. There was a kind of conspicuous absence, and I'm sure it might be intentional, of Guinea in the kind of situation in Guinea around 1958 and their kind of relationship to France. From what you were saying here, and I was interested because it seems like such an interesting case in that it was part of this larger French West African community, but then didn't stick with it, of course, in the 1958 vote, and then later created a confederation with Ghana. And so what kind of role does Guinea play in all of this kind of politics about layered sovereignty in the way that France is thinking about French West Africa, and maybe the way that Senghor is thinking about what federation might mean within French West Africa?
Well, I think the story of Guinea has to be narrated over time as well. Sékou Touré was for a long time a backer of African unity, and specifically of an African federation. So on that note, he was on the same. He was singing the same tune as Senghor. They completely agreed on the importance of having an African federation. But Sékou Touré repeatedly invoked that this African federation should be part of what he called a Franco-African community. And at this point, the big division was between Senghor and Sékou Touré on one side, and actually more than half of it, I think, of the big leaders were on that side, and of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, whose picture I showed, on the other. And there are some others who agreed with that. In Apiti and Dahomey was on the side of Houphouët-Boigny. But Sékou Touré of Guinea and Senghor were both advocates of the Franco-African community. The reason why Guinea voted no when the other territories or the member states voted, or would-be member states voted yes, I think is highly contingent. Betsy Schmidt argues that it's a bottom-up radicalization that puts pressure on Sékou Touré. If the vote in Guinea had been 60% no, I would have believed that theory. It was 94% no. And 94, when you have votes of 94% no, and the Côte d'Ivoire you had 99% yes. I think the explanation for the yes and the no is basically the same. That is that you had a top-down structure, and a very capable top-down structure in both places. These were political parties that could get people to vote the way they wanted to. Why did Sékou Touré opt for the no? And here we're talking about something that's very personal. And I think it had a lot to do between the relationship between de Gaulle and Sékou Touré, who ended up insulting each other and pushing each other into a no exit position. So I think it's a highly contingent phenomenon why Guinea voted no, and then it suffered the consequences because de Gaulle made good on his threats. He said if you pull out, you're on your own. If you want independence, it's yours for the asking, and you have to deal with life on your own, and that's what happened.
I'm Leila Kawar. I write about France and law, and you mentioned in all of these different metamorphoses how people could vote in constituent assemblies, various assemblies. What did the legal side look like? Because one aspect of citizenship is whether you have access to courts. Mm-hmm. Did you come across documents where courts were filling in any significant policy areas? Was it something that was contested, whether they could appeal to the Cour de Cassation? Actually, in the American case, before the Civil War, this was one of the elements of whether the U.S. Supreme Court had the final say or not. So it must have been at least somewhat relevant.
It's very relevant. In principle, under the 1946 Constitution, there was only one legal regime. Everybody had access to it on exactly the same terms. What this means at the jurisdictions, the base jurisdictions, is something that somebody else is going to have to study, because it's a question I don't think is going to have any one answer. That you'll find that there are lots of questions of differential access to courts. Where I've seen it is at the highest level, at the Conseil d'État. And there the Conseil d'État did pronounce on on questions of relevance to the colonies, and very much trying to support what the logic of the Constitution of 1946. And the most notable decision of the Conseil d'Etat was in 1955, when they held that the legislature's failure to enact a law to say how the right of renunciation of one's civil status would be practiced, to spell out, you do this, you do that, that this could not be an excuse for denying people this right, and that the state had to give people the right to do this. And then they proposed a very simple method of essentially having a judge rubber stamp, just verifying the accuracy of the application, rather than having a whole bunch of hoops that people had to jump through. So in that sense, the Conseil d'Etat intervened to say that the basic principles of equivalence and the basic following of the logic of the 1946 Constitution had to be followed. But I think there's a rich field for study to go look in rural areas, look in urban areas, look at people of different socioeconomic situations, and see what law really meant in the 1950s, and then how that plays out after independence. In principle, no. And the switch in 1958 from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic kept intact the original constitutional provisions on citizenship and on multiple status, having multiple status regimes. So that, in principle, shouldn't change. However, one important aspect did, and that's who keeps the état civil, because that's the recording of birth, marriage, death, inheritance, filiation. This was up until the law that provided for decentralization, the 1956 law. This was something that the French government took as its own responsibility, and the état civil is about as French can be. So there's very, very strong idea this is our thing. But after 1956, it became a matter for the individual territoire d'outre-mer, and then for the member states to do. So they're essentially pushing the responsibility for how you keep track of things. But in fact, keeping track of marriage is also defining what marriage is. So this was a loaded issue, and it ends up being debated within the national assemblies, although the debates I know are actually after independence in 1960-61 in the case of Senegal.
Very much.